Good morning, everybody. Happy Thursday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed we do. Quite a bombshell dropped yesterday afternoon, actually, just before we were about to plan this show. The U.S. intelligence agencies agreeing, basically, with Russia's assessment of who detonated that car bomb and assassinated one of their citizens, I guess, right-wing, what'd you call her, intellectual?
Daughter of
journalist,
I don't know. There's
pundit. Anyway, we'll get into all of that. Quite a stunning revelation, though, as we continue to have concerns about whether Russia is going to ultimately detonate a tactical nuclear weapon and what all of that would mean. At the same time, this is also massive news. OPEC meeting deciding to cut production by quite a significant amount. That is almost certainly going to show up in terms of heightened gas prices for you. The Biden administration responding at this point with some pretty strong words, but a markedly different tone and approach towards Saudi Arabia from them. Also some political fallout, some comments that actually were quite good from Ro Khanna. Another senator, Chris Murphy, as well. So we'll bring you all of the political fallout and what that means. They also are moving towards easing some sanctions to potentially reopen relations with Venezuela. So a lot of movement there in terms of gas. At the same time, we still have our eye on those protests unfolding in Iran. We'll give you an update there and some details about what some of the underlying causes might be. There was a significant work stoppage at that Staten Island warehouse, Amazon warehouse, and Amazon has now suspended 50 workers there over that. So we'll bring you those details. Our own Jared Cheriton has been reporting on that. And we've got a little update for you on Taylor Lorenz spreading COVID anti-vax misinformation.
Yes. Anti-vax misinformation.
Right. So
but this is the allowed kind.
Yes, right. Yeah. It came from her, so it's allowed, right? She's the hall monitor, so the hall monitor, I guess, can do whatever they want. Saagar's looking at Elon Musk potentially buying Twitter and the freak out over that. I'm looking at comedian Bill Burr's kind of surprising comments about socialism and about capitalism. I have an interesting guest on to talk about what is going on with men, new theme on the show lately. But before we get to any of that, live show.
Live show. Put it up there on the screen. Chicago, we're planning it right now. We've got an awesome segment. It's going to be a lot of audience interaction. As we said, go ahead and buy your tickets there. We've got the last remaining tickets. I think that people are really, really going to enjoy the show. We've got some fun stuff planned that we've learned from our debut in Atlanta, and then we're going to announce new dates very, very soon for the rest of the country. But like we said, if you're in the Midwest, I'd highly recommend coming to this show because it's very unlikely that we're going to do other days, just scheduling and the way that this all works out. Number two, counterpoints. Throw that one up there on the screen. They did a fantastic job yesterday. They really did. I was looking through some of their topics. I just love some of the things that they, I wouldn't even think to cover. You know, Emily's monologue, things like that, which are just very unique to them as people, but they also touch on the news. You guys seem to really enjoy it. The show did quite well. So we've got that discount going on right now, 10% off on the annual membership. Really helps us fund both that and then obviously our new hire, which was made entirely possible by the expansion that you guys are funding. So thank you all very much. There's a link down in the description that you can take advantage of.
Yeah, one of the things I was a little bit nervous about when their show launched was that like we'd be stepping on each other's toes in terms of covering the same topics. Yeah. Really not. I mean, they do have a different lens. Different things pop up and are interesting to them, and they also have slightly different ideologies than we do. So I think it's been a really great addition to the ecosystem. You guys seem to think so as well.
Totally agree.
So thank you for helping support us and make that happen, make the new hire happen, and all of those good things.
That's right.
With all of that being said, let's get to the news.
Let's get to the big bombshell, really. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. A major leak in the New York Times dropping yesterday. Very coordinated, and let's read it all very carefully. The headline, U.S. believes Ukrainians were behind an assassination in Russia. Subhead, American officials said they are not aware of the plan ahead of the time for attack that killed Daria Dugina, and they had admonished Ukraine over it. So let's go and take a trip down memory lane. A couple of months ago, we covered the story in August that Daria Dugina, who is the daughter of Alexander Dugin, who himself is, it's difficult. I don't even think calling him left or right wing is really all that useful in the U.S. political context.
He's uber nationalist,
ultra nationalist, revanchist Russian who believes in like restoring the glory of the Russian Tsardom and empire. That's probably, and then very anti-European Union,
conservative.
Very socially conservative, but not even necessarily in the context we would understand, more in the like Russian Orthodox Church and the fusion of the state. something that you would have to go like 100 years back in order to really understand in Russian context. Anyway, so this has been an intellectual, quote unquote, in Russia for quite some time. Frankly, probably overstated by the West and even by the Ukrainians in terms of his influence. He's been sidelined before by Putin, but they like to keep him around because he always justifies their invasions of Georgia. He was beating the drum for years about invading Ukraine, saying it's not a real country, etc. So you could think of him as, I don't even really know if he has a U.S. analog. Whoever the most neocon of neocons was in the middle of the Iraq War. Think about it, like the guy who was defending Bush in 2005. That's basically the equivalent of who Alexander Dugin is. Anyway, his daughter, as we said, was blown up in a car bombing in Moscow, a Moscow suburb. Now, it was believed at the time that he was the target and that his daughter actually had gotten into the car, and as she was driving down the road, that her car blew up as she was driving. She was only 29 years old. Lots of speculation about what happened, including here on this show. At that time, we had a couple of theories. Number one was this could be a false flag by the Russian state authorities.
Yeah.
You take out somebody who is supposedly sympathetic, you blame it on the Ukrainians, and then you say this is a pretext for eventual escalation against Ukraine. And by the way, after his daughter was killed, what do you think Alexander Dugin called for? Immediately, right? So that was one theory. And again, there was really no way to know, and it's not like you would put that against the Russians. The Russians, though, at the time adamantly claimed, and look, I mean, it's not like they have a lot of credibility, so you should take it for what it is. They were like, no, we believe this was the Ukrainian intelligence services. They had pictures that they had released of the so-called assassin. They said that she was an employee of Ukrainian intelligence who had crossed from Estonia into Russia.
Well, I think it was from Ukraine into Russia and then fled to Estonia.
That's right. So Ukraine, Russia, Estonia. Estonia matters also because it's a NATO country, and as to whether they even knew about it in the first place. Anyway, basically what we said and most people said at the time is, we'll never know. Well, now, I guess, if you are to believe them, and of course this is always the issue, who do you take the word for? The Russian FSB, CIA, the Ukrainian intelligence services?
Like when they agree with each other, then you might be able to say this is probably what happened.
It's possible, yeah. It's very possibly credulous. I'm trying to treat everybody as skeptically as I can. Anyway, I think the fact that this article exists in and of itself is very noteworthy because it says that the United States intelligence agencies have concluded the parts of the Ukrainian government, that's another key part, were authorized the car bomb attack near Moscow in August that killed Daria Dugina. That intelligence assessment was made not necessarily declassified, but was made widely available to the U.S. intelligence community last week. That tells me something very important, Krystal, which is that they have had this assessment now for quite some time. It's October 6th. This happened on August 21st. Why now? There's a lot of questions. One of the time-old tactics in the U.S. intelligence community is if you want something to leak, you just make it more available to as many people as possible. And that is exactly what happened here because almost immediately after it was made widely available, it ends up on the front page of the New York Times. So what can we take away from this? It says specifically in here that the U.S. was not aware of the attack, was not aware, took no part in the attack, and had privately admonished the Ukrainians for doing something like this. Also, what came away, and actually is very important to me, is they also said it is possible that Zelensky himself did not know about this. And they allude in the piece to competing centers of power in the Ukrainian government, as in intelligence services that may or may not actually answer to Mr. Zelensky. This is a country in the middle of a war. They, before this, it's not a secret that they had a lot of corruption. Zelensky himself has already fired two of the most senior people in the Ukrainian government. Not
also had these sort of like independent militias that have just recently been incorporated into the overall armed forces.
Exactly. So the parties also have had, it's political turmoil in
more
Ukraine.
and less hawkish factions, different ideologies, all of those things.
This is a classic hallmark of any state, basically in the middle of an existential conflict, especially one without robust institutions like Ukraine, which was already had corruption problems as the beginning of this. Now, I think that the major takeaway from this, to me, and I'm curious what you think, is they are releasing this and leaking this now because Ukraine either has already done something just as highly provocative or was on the verge of doing something highly provocative. And this is kind of a bat signal to be sent out into the world and just be like, hey, we know what you did. Clearly also, they said that they had admonished them. If the Ukrainians had listened to the so-called admonishment, I don't think that this piece would have showed up. They probably said screw off, or they continued to deny it. Hence the leak that comes out that really casts them. This is one of the first stories I have ever seen that really admonishes the Ukrainians for going into a territory which is incredibly dangerous. I mean, they carried out, if we are to believe this, an assassination inside of Russia, not just inside of Russia, against a high-profile figure in Moscow, in the capital of Russia. I mean, you cannot think of something that is more provocative than that. And it also opens the question of like, well, what other covert operations are the Ukrainians doing that the U.S. may or may not have approved of? It also, the second thing I just want to highlight before I'll get to what your takeaway is, Krystal, is they said that the U.S. officials remain frustrated that Ukraine refuses to share intelligence or military plans, especially covert operations inside of Russia. And they also said, Krystal, that often, especially before this latest round of offensive by the Ukrainians did not want to share military plans. They did not want Washington to get insight, specifically because A, they didn't want us to either adjust aid or not. They wanted us to just take their word for it, and they like to keep us in the dark as possible while the checks continue to roll on in to keep our input to an absolute low and let them do whatever they please. So lots of commentary on that front as well.
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, the first thing to say about this is that this is utter madness. I mean, we're talking about a political assassination of a civilian, a Russian civilian on Russian soil. Like, the level of escalation that represents is dramatic. And I know that a lot of people out there will be like, come on, like, Russia invaded their country. Like, they're getting bombed. This isn't like you're going to freak out over this. This is all in the context of trying to avoid a nuclear war. So again, an attack directly on Russian soil, a political targeted assassination on Russian soil of a Russian civilian in Moscow, where then the assassin flees to a NATO country, Estonia. This is mind-blowing bombshell stuff. In terms of this report and sort of what I have the most confidence is true and what I have the least confidence is true, when you have the official Russian line lining up with the official U.S. line, right, I think you can put a lot of credence in that. And the Ukrainians have not really outright denied that they were involved in this either. So I think that's all important to keep in mind. So that's the piece that I actually have the most confidence in. The parts about, oh, you know, the U.S., really the intelligence community trying to paint themselves very well here. We had no idea. We had no involvement. The parts about, oh, maybe Zelensky didn't know, trying to sort of keep his hands clean in all of this because, of course, he's been held up as, you know, the Churchill of the whole situation. Those are the pieces that maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. I'm a little bit more skeptical of that part. I think you're right about the likely intent of this leak, because all of these leaks that, you know, directly from the intelligence community, they all have some sort of political intent behind them. I think probably you're right that the most likely thing here is that the U.S. is getting increasingly pissed off that the Ukrainians are freelancing and in this sort of like adventurous, incredibly dangerous, potentially escalatory way, and are not scaling those things back. And so this was a way to really try to ultimately smack them down.
Right.
I think it's also really worth underscoring the fact that we covered that report a while ago. It was some of the only like a little bit critical coverage that we've seen from the New York Times about how the U.S. was openly admitting they had more insight into what Russia was doing, because of course we have decades and decades of infiltrating them, spying on them, and all sorts of assets there. And we really were kind of blind about what the Ukrainians were doing and what their plans were. Now, after that report, there were subsequent reports that were like, oh, we worked that all out and that's all fixed. No. No.
That does not seem to be the case. A lot of sense.
That does not seem to be the case. And so from a U.S. domestic perspective, think of the insanity we're engaged in right now. I mean, we're going to talk about more military aid flowing there. We've helped them with intelligence. We've helped them with cyber capabilities. I mean, we are all in on this war effectively in all but, you know, the reality of boots on the ground. And we don't know what their plans are. They're hiding things from us. They're engaging these sorts of like targeted assassinations without our knowledge. That is wild stuff, and it should not be permitted to continue. And ultimately, like Biden loves to pretend like, oh, we're hands off and they're just gonna do. No. We have so much sway and so much influence in terms of what is happening there. They could not have gotten anywhere close to where they are now without our arms, our training, and our intelligence. We have incredible influence over what and how they prosecute this war, and we ought to be using it because this is complete insanity.
Yeah, and I just want to tug on that thread, which is, look, if Ukraine wants to put itself in a position where they are going to assassinate people in Moscow, be my guest. But then the risk is all yours and it's not ours.
Yes.
And unfortunately, though, they want to take the most provocative action and then socialize the risks to us and to all of NATO. That is the issue. And also the issue remains, if we are going to continue giving them essentially 98% of what they ask for, then what good is any admonishment? I mean, frankly, the Ukrainians kind of remind me of the Israelis right now, where they're like, yeah, they're not going to do anything. They're like, we got too much pressure. They're like, we can do basically whatever we want. We can have sovereign territory if they wanted to, like the Israelis, violate the law, have the UN or even the US intelligence community privately admonish them. But at a public level, like, they know that they could basically get away with it. And, that's basically what happened. Let's put this on the screen. I mean, effectively days after the US supposedly admonished the Ukrainians, the US announced another $625 million in new military aid for Ukraine. Again, more than the country of Germany and France in total, just so everybody's aware. And that military package is all after the annexing of the 4 regions. There is some speculation, Krystal, and behind the scenes from people I spoke to, is that one of the reasons that this came out is because President Biden had a very long phone call with President Zelensky. Just right before that they released this aid.
Like Tuesday, right?
It was on Tuesday. And during that phone call, it was right after they announced this aid, though. It is posited that he probably brought up this U.S. intel and was like, hey, maybe you should cut this out. And I don't think that they would leak it without some authorization at the highest levels of government, that there was at least a feeling that the Ukrainians were going too far, were not listening, were telling us to effectively screw off. So this really just highlights the duality of Washington policy. On the one hand, we give Ukraine almost 98% of what it wants, support all but their most maximalist of maximalist aims. And on the other, we're like, hey, stop assassinating people inside of Russia. Now, look, as you said, the Russians do this stuff all the time to their own citizens and in Ukraine. So it's not like we're saying that Russia has been unfairly, given something that it never does. No, I mean, they've probably done this on an even bigger scale. But it does really remind me, I know this is hokey, but like of that Dark Knight quote where it's like, you either die a hero or just live long enough to, it's like, why become even a part of your enemy? And because then at what point do you remain the moral high ground? Because of course, Ukraine was invaded, it's a sovereign country, it didn't do anything to Russia. It didn't do anything to them. But, embracing these horrific tactics of targeted political assassination is both incredibly risky for your own nation and highlights how existential they think the stakes are. And if they think it's that way, again, that's fine for you, but your risk should remain yours. We are now in a situation where, and I think you probably agree with this, I don't see a situation where if things escalate to the nuclear level, even quote unquote tactical, that we don't somehow get dragged into this war. I see no situation.
I can't imagine it. Can't. I really can't. I mean, it's very hard to imagine that there isn't then an escalatory chain that leads at the very least to us being directly involved, let alone, and certainly could possibly lead to all-out nuclear war, which is the thing that we should. I mean, I really do sort of feel like I'm taking crazy pills here because we're literally we have never since the Cuban Missile Crisis been this close to a nuclear exchange. And it's sort of like the plot of Don't Look Up, where everybody's just like continuing to go about their business and media's like barely paying attention. And I mean, none of this has really been laid out and explained to the American people what an incredibly precarious, dangerous situation we're in. And why this report struck me in particular is because it was a reminder of the fact that within the Zelensky government and domestic political, hothouse, there are factions that look at nuclear weapons sort of the way that Putin and the Russians seem to, which is also believing like, oh, well, you know, it wouldn't be the end of the world. It's worth risking that potentiality. And I say that because Yegor actually pointed out to me there's, you know, a sort of influential commentator, ally of Zelensky, who outright said, like, oh, the West is so afraid of nuclear weapons. We're not that afraid of it. Like, all full of bluster. I mean, there is that faction. And there's even more of a faction that from the beginning has been very interested in trying to escalate this war to force us in on the Ukrainian side. I can't even blame them for that, because that's just like rational when you're facing an existential threat. I want my big brother to come in fully on my side and stop messing around with this, like limiting what weapons we can get and playing cute like they're not involved here. I want them all the way in. And so when I see this sort of, you know, dangerous adventurism with a political assassination on Russian soil, it reminded me that, you know, for them, if there is that escalation, it's not all bad in their view. That should be another like dire warning for us and reminder that we have to be really, really careful about protecting not just US interests, like the interests of the world as a whole. And that's what this really ultimately underscored for me, because this is, I mean, it's just an incredibly, incredibly dangerous situation. And the fact that we have gone this far with the U.S. still having a lot of blind spots about what exactly the Ukrainians are up to, that should be deeply, deeply troubling to everyone who's looking at this.
That's right. And let's put this on the screen finally, just for people who are interested. This was the official, you know, blame by Moscow on Ukraine in that death. As we said, the circumstances are they accused a Ukrainian intelligence agent of crossing from Ukraine into Russia and effectively then fleeing into Estonia. Estonia, of course, matters because at that time, they said there would be a reason for the Russian Federation to take actions against the Estonian state. Estonia is, of course, a NATO country and has been one of the biggest beaters for war, which we're about to get to. So there's also could involve a NATO intelligence service, which itself would also be a tremendous danger given the fact that Article 5, I mean, even if the United States did not know about this and admonished them, remember, we are bound by blood all the way up until the borders of the Baltics with Article 5. That's why, I mean, I've gotten some pushback from people like, no, there's no way the U.S. would. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, this is just like 1914. Like, in terms of the alliances, like, we have a tripwire. These are Senate ratified treaties. There's no debate. It's automatic. Like, if they go in, we're in. If there is some sort of escalation or something, like we don't have a lot of say into how exactly it's all going to play out just because the escalation ladder goes up very, very quickly.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.